Stacey together with my partner Louie. Today we're going to tackle about Erikson's Post-Freudian Theory. First off, who was Eric Erickson? Was he a Dane, a German, or an American? Jew or Gentile? Artist or psychoanalyst? Erikson himself had difficulty answering these questions, and he spent nearly a lifetime trying to determine who he was. Born June 15, 1902, in southern Germany, Erikson was brought up by his mother and stepfather, but he remained uncertain of the true identity of his biological father. To discover his niche in life, Erikson ventured away from home during late adolescence, adopting life of a wandering artist and poet. After nearly 7 years of drifting and searching, he returned home confused, exhausted, depressed, and unable to sketch or paint. At this time, a fortuitous event changed his life. He received a letter from his friend Peter Bloss, inviting him to teach children in a new school in Vienna. One of the founders of the school was Anna Freud, who became not only Erikson's employer, but his psychoanalyst as well. While undergoing analytic treatment, he stressed to Anna Freud that his most difficult problem was searching for the identity of his biological father. However, this Freud was less than emphatic and told Erikson that he should stop fantasizing about his absent father. Although Erikson usually obeyed his psychoanalyst, he could not take Freud's advice to stop trying to learn from his father's name. While in Vienna, Erikson met and, with Anna Freud's permission, married Johann Serson, a Canadian-born dancer, artist, and teacher who had also undergone psychoanalysis. With her psychoanalytic background and her facility with the English language, she became a valuable editor and occasional co-author of Erikson's books. The Eriksons had 4 children: sons Kai, John, and Neil, and daughter Sue. Kai and Sue pursued important professional careers, but John, who shared his father's experience as a wandering artist, worked as a laborer and never felt emotionally close to his parents. Erikson's search for identity took him through some difficult experiences during his adult developmental stage. According to Erikson, this stage requires a person to take care of children, products, and ideas that he or she has generated. On this issue, Erikson was deficient in meeting his own standards. He failed to take good care of his son Neil, who was born with Down syndrome. At the hospital while Johann was still under sedation, Eric agreed to place Neil in an institution. Then he went home and told his 3 other children that their brother had died at birth. He lied to them much as his mother had lied to him about his identity. Later, he told his oldest son Kai the truth, but he continued to deceive the 2 younger children, John and Sue. Although his mother's lie had distressed him greatly, he failed to understand that his lie about Neil might later distress his other children. In deceiving his children the way he did, Erikson violated 2 of his own principles. First, don't lie to people you should care for, and don't pit one family member against another. To compound the situation, when Neil died at about age 20, the Eriksons who were in Europe at the time called Sue and John and instructed them to handle all the funeral arrangements for a brother they had never met, and who they only recently knew existed. Erikson also sought his identity through the myriad changes of jobs and places of residence. Lacking any academic credentials, he He had no specific professional identity and was variously known as an artist, a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, a clinician, a professor, a cultural anthropologist, an existentialist, a psychobiographer, and a public intellectual. In 1933, with fascism on the rise in Europe, Erikson and his family left Vienna for Denmark, hoping to gain Danish citizenship. When Danish officials refused his request, he left Copenhagen and immigrated to the United States. In America, he changed his name from Homburger to Erikson. This change was a crucial turning point in his life because it represented a retreat from his earlier Jewish identification. Originally, Erikson resented any implication that he was abandoning his Jewish identity by changing his name. He countered these charges by pointing out that he used his full name, Eric Homburger Erikson, in his books and essays. However, as time passed, he dropped his middle name and replaced it with the initial H. Thus, this person who at the end of life was known as Erik H. Erikson had previously been called Erik Salomonsen, Erik Homburger, and Erik Homburger Erikson. In America, Erikson continued his pattern of moving from place to place. He first settled in the Boston area where he set up a modified psychoanalytic practice. With neither medical credentials nor any kind of college degree, he accepted research positions at Massachusetts General Hospital, Harvard Medical School, and Harvard Psychological Clinic. Wanting to write but needing more time than his busy schedule in Boston and Cambridge allowed, Erikson took a position at Yale in 1936. But after 2.5 years, he moved to the University of California at Berkeley. But not before living among and studying people of the Sioux Nation on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. He later lived with people of the Yurok Nation in Northern California, and these experiences in cultural anthropology added to the richness and completeness of his concept of humanity. During his California period, Erikson gradually evolved a theory of personality, separate from but not incompatible with Freud's. In 1950, Erikson published Childhood and Society, a book that at first glance appears to be a hodgepodge of unrelated chapters. Erikson himself originally had some difficulty finding a common theme underlying such topics as childhood in 2 Native American tribes, the growth of the ego, the 8 stages of human development, and Hitler's childhood. Eventually, however, he recognized that the influence of psychological, cultural, and historical factors on identity was the underlying element that held the various chapters together. Childhood and Society, which became a classic and gave Erikson an international reputation as an imaginative thinker, remains the finest introduction to his post-Freudian personality theory. In 1949, the University of California officials demanded that faculty members sign an oath pledging loyalty to the United States. Such a demand was not uncommon during those days when Senator Joseph McCarthy convinced many Americans that communists and communist sympathizers were poised to overthrow the U.S. government. Erikson was not a communist, but as a matter of principle, he refused to sign the oath. Although the Committee on Privilege and Tenure recommended that he retain his position, Erikson left California and returned to Massachusetts, where he worked as a therapist at Austin Riggs, a treatment center for psychoanalytic training and research located in Stockbridge. In 1960, he returned to Harvard and for the next 10 years held the position of professor of human development. After retirement, Erikson continued an active career writing, lecturing, and seeing a few patients. During the early years of his retirement, he lived in Marine Country, California, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Cape Cod. Through all these changes, Erikson continued to seek his father's name. He died May 12, 1994 at the age of 90. Who was Eric Erickson? Although he himself may not have been able to answer this question, other people can learn about the person known as Eric Erickson through his brilliantly constructed books, lectures, and essays. So, the overview of Post-Freudian Theory. Eric Erickson, the person who coined the term identity crisis. Erikson had no college degree of any kind, but his lack of formal training did not prevent him from gaining world fame in an impressive variety of fields including psychoanalysis, anthropology, psychohistory, and education. Unlike earlier psychodynamic theorists, who severed nearly all ties to Freudian psychoanalysis, Erikson intended his theory of personality to extend rather than repudiate Freud's assumptions and to offer a new way of looking at things. His post-Freudian theory extended Freud's infantile development stages into adolescence, adulthood, and old age. Erikson suggested that at each stage a specific psychosocial struggle contributes to the formation of personality. From adolescence on, that struggle takes the form of an identity crisis, a turning point in one's life that may either strengthen or weaken personality. Erikson regarded his post-Freudian theory as an extension of psychoanalysis, something Freud might have done in time, although he used Freudian theory as the foundation for his life cycle approach to personality. Erikson differed from Freud in several aspects. In addition to elaborating on psychosexual stages beyond childhood, Erikson placed more emphasis on both social and historical influences. The ego has no strength of its own, but must borrow its energy from the id. Moreover, the ego is constantly attempting to balance blind demands of the superego against the relentless forces of the id and the realistic opportunities of the external world. Freud believed that, for psychologically healthy people, the ego is sufficiently developed to reign in the id, even though its control is still tenuous and id impulses might erupt and overwhelm the ego at any time. In contrast, Erikson held that our ego is a positive force that creates a self-identity, a sense of I. As the center of our personality, our ego helps us adapt to the various conflicts and crises of life, and keeps us from losing our individuality to the leveling forces of society. During childhood, the ego is weak, pliable, and fragile, but by adolescence, it should begin to take form and gain strength. Throughout our life, it unifies personality and guards against indivisibility. Erikson saw the ego as a partially unconscious organizing agency that synthesizes our present experiences with past self-identities, and also with anticipated images of self. He defined the ego as a person's ability to unify experiences and actions in an adaptive manner. Erikson identified three interrelated aspects of ego: the body ego, the ego ideal, and ego identity. The body ego refers to experiences with our body, a way of seeing our physical self as different from other people. We may be satisfied or dissatisfied with the way our body looks and functions, but we recognize that it is the only body we will ever have. The ego ideal represents the image we have of ourselves in comparison with an established ideal. It is responsible for our being satisfied or dissatisfied not only with our physical self, but with our entire personal identity. Ego identity is the image we have of ourselves in a variety of social roles we play. Although adolescence is ordinarily the time when these three components are changing most rapidly, alterations in body ego, ego ideal, and ego identity can and do take place at any stage of life. Although inborn capacities are important in personality development, the ego emerges from and is largely shaped by society. Erikson's emphasis on social and historical factors was in contrast with Freud's mostly biological viewpoint. To Erikson, the ego exists as a potential at birth, but it must emerge from within a cultural environment. Different societies with their variations in child-rearing practices tend to shape personalities that fit the needs and values of their culture. For example, Erikson found that prolonged and permissive nursing of infants of the Sioux Nation, sometimes for as long as 4 to 5 years, resulted in what Freud would call oral personalities. That is, people who gain great pleasure through functions of the mouth. The Sioux placed great value in generosity, and Erikson believed that the reassurance resulting from unlimited breastfeeding lays the foundation of the virtue of generosity. However, Sioux parents quickly suppress biting, a practice that may contribute to the child's fortitude and ferocity. On the other hand, people of the Yurok nation set strict regulations concerning elimination of urine and feces, practices that tend to develop anality or compulsive neatness, stubbornness, and miserliness. In European American societies, orality and anality are often considered undesirable traits or neurotic symptoms. Erikson, however, argued that orality among the Sioux hunters and anality among the Yurok fishermen are adaptive characteristics that help both the individual and the culture. The fact that European American culture views orality and anality as deviant traits merely displays its own ethnocentric view of other societies. Erikson argued that historically all tribes or nations, including the United States, have developed what called pseudospecies. That is, an illusion perpetrated and perpetuated by a particular society that is somehow chosen to be the human species. In past centuries, this belief has aided the survival of the tribe, with modern means of world annihilation such as prejudiced perception, as demonstrated by Nazi Germany, threatens the survival of every nation. One of Erikson's principal contributions to personality theory was his extension of the Freudian early stages of development to include school age, youth, adulthood, and old age. Before looking more closely to Erikson's theory of ego development, we discuss his view of how personality develops from one stage to the next. Erikson believed that the ego develops throughout the various stages of life according to an epigenetic principle. a term borrowed from embryology. Epigenetic development implies a step-by-step growth of fetal organs. The embryo does not begin as a completely formed little person, waiting to merely expand its structure and form. Rather, it develops or should be developed, according to predetermined rate and in a fixed sequence. If the eyes, liver, or other organs do not develop during the critical period for their development, then they will never attain proper maturity. In similar fashion, the ego follows the path of epigenetic development, with each stage developing at its proper time. One stage emerges from and is built upon a previous stage, but it does not replace the earlier stage. This epigenetic development is analogous to the physical development of children, who crawl before they walk, walk before they run, and run before they jump. When children are still crawling, they are developing the potential to walk, run, and jump. And after they are mature enough to jump, they still retain their ability to run, walk, and crawl. Erikson described epigenetic principle by saying that anything that grows has a ground plan, and that out of his ground plan the parts arise, each part having its time of special ascendancy, until all parts have arisen to form a functioning whole. Epigenesis means that one characteristic develops on top of another in space and time. The epigenetic principle is illustrated in Figure 7.1, which depicts the first three Ericksonian stages, the sequence of stages 1, 2, and 3, and the development of their component parts A, B, and C are shown in the heavily lined boxes along the diagonal figure 7.1. It shows that each part exists before its critical time, emerges at its proper time, and finally continues to develop during subsequent stages. For example, component part B of stage 2, early childhood, exists during stage 1, which is infancy, as shown in box 1B. Part B reaches its full ascendance during stage 2, and it's shown in box 2B, but continues into stage 3, box 3B. Similarly, all components of stage 3 exist during stages 1 and 2, which full development during stage 3, and continue throughout all stages. Erikson insisted that personality is a product of history, culture, and biology, and his diverse methods of investigation reflect this belief. He employed anthropological, historical, sociological, and clinical methods to learn about children, adolescents, mature adults, and elderly people. He studied middle-class Americans, European children, people of the Sioux and Yurok nations of North America, and even sailors on a submarine. He wrote biographical portraits of Adolf Hitler, Maxim Gorky, Martin Luther, and Mohandas K. Gandhi, among others. In this section, we present two approaches Erikson used to explain and describe human personality: anthropological studies and psychohistory. First off is anthropological studies. In 1937, Erikson made a field trip to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota to investigate the causes of apathy among the Sioux children. Erikson reported on early Sioux training in terms of his newly evolving theories of psychosexual and psychosocial development. He found that apathy was an expression of an extreme dependency to the Sioux and had developed as a result of their reliance on various federal government programs. At one time, they had been courageous buffalo hunters, but by 1937, the Sioux had lost their group of identity as hunters and were trying half-heartedly to scrape out a living as farmers. Child-rearing practices, which in the past had trained young boys to be hunters and young girls to be helpers and mothers of future hunters, were no longer appropriate for an agrarian society. As a consequence, the Sioux children of 1937 had great difficulty achieving a sense of ego identity, especially after they reached adolescence. 2 years later, Erikson made a similar field trip to Northern California to study people of the Yurok Nation, who lived mostly in salmon fishing. Although the Sioux and Yurok had vastly divergent cultures, each tribe had a tradition of training its youth in virtues of its society. Yurok people were trained to catch fish, and therefore they possessed no strong national feelings and had little taste of war. Obtaining and retaining provisions and possessions were highly valued among people of the Yurok nation. Erikson was able to show that early childhood training was consistent with this strong cultural value and that history and society helped shape personality. The discipline called psychohistory is a controversial field that combines psychoanalytic concepts with historical methods. Freud originated psychohistory with an investigation of Leonardo da Vinci and later collaborated with American ambassador William Bullitt to write a book-length psychological study of American President Woodrow Wilson. Although Erikson deplored this later work, he took up the methods of psychohistory and refined them, especially in his study of Martin Luther and Mahatma Gandhi. Both Luther and Gandhi had an important impact on history because each was exceptional person with right personal conflict living during a historical period that needed to resolve collectively what could not be resolved individually. Erikson defines psychohistory as the study of individual and collective life with the combined methods of psychoanalysis and history. He used psychohistory to demonstrate his fundamental beliefs that each person is a product of his or her historical time, and that those historical times are influenced by exceptional leaders experiencing a personal identity conflict. As an author of psychohistory, Erikson believed that he should be emotionally involved in his subject. For example, he developed a strong emotional attachment to Gandhi, which he attributed to his own lifelong search for the father he had never seen. In Gandhi's Truth, Erikson revealed strong positive feelings for Gandhi as he attempted to answer the question of how healthy individuals as Gandhi work through conflict and crisis when other people are debilitated by lesser strife. In searching for an answer, Erikson examined Gandhi's entire life cycle but concentrated on one particular crisis, which climaxed when a middle-aged Gandhi first used self-imposing fasting as political weapon. As a child, Gandhi was close to his mother but experienced conflict with his father. Rather than viewing this situation as Oedipal conflict, Erikson saw it as Gandhi's opportunity to work out conflict with authority figures, an opportunity Gandhi was to have many times during his life. Gandhi was born October 2, 1869 in Porbandar, India. As a young man, he studied law in London and was inconspicuous in manner and appearance. Then, dressed like a proper British subject, he returned to India to practice law. After 2 years of unsuccessful practice, he went to South Africa, which, like India, was a British colony. He intended to remain for a year, but his first year's identity crisis kept him there for more than 20 years. A week after a judge excluded him from courtroom, Gandhi was thrown off a train when he refused to give up his seat to a white man. These two experiences with racial prejudice changed Gandhi's life. By the time he resolved this identity crisis, his appearance had changed dramatically. No longer attired in silk hat and black coat, he dressed in the cotton loincloth and shawl that were to become familiar to millions of people throughout the world. During those years in South Africa, he evolved the technique of passive resistance known as Satyagraha and used it to solve his conflicts with authorities. Satyagraha is a Sanskrit term meaning a tenacious, stubborn method of gathering the truth. One of Erikson's major contributions was to extend personality development into adulthood. By expanding Freud's notion of development all the way into old age, Erikson challenged the idea that psychological development stops with childhood. Erikson's most influential legacy has been his theory of development, and in particular the stages from adolescence into old age. He was one of the first theorists to emphasize the critical period of adolescence and the conflicts revolving around one's search for an identity. Adolescents and young adults often ask, "Who am I? Where am I going? And what do I want to do with the rest of my life?" How they answer these questions plays an important role in what kinds of relationships they develop, who they choose for a life partner, and what career paths they follow. Recall that Erikson argued that each stage of development emerges from and is built upon a previous stage. So, for example, identity achievement in adolescence involves having explored various elements of oneself, both ideological and interpersonal, and coming to what Erikson called a commitment. Studies of Western cultures conclude that identity achievement is the healthiest ego identity status, and that it ought to predict successful resolutions of the next developmental task of intimacy and generativity. However, Erikson also argued that despite this stepwise quality of personal unfolding, all developmental tasks are present in some way at every stage of life, even if they vary in how pressing they are at different points. Thus, for teens involved in solidifying their identity, concerns about intimacy and even generativity are meaningful and present. Scholars have thus studied later psychosocial crises in earlier stages of life as a way of seeing how successful resolution of developmental tasks can be fostered at young ages. In contrast to most other psychodynamic theories, Erikson stimulated quite a bit empirical research, much of it on adolescence, young adulthood, and adulthood. Here we discuss recent research on development in adolescence and early and middle adulthood, specifically the task of identity and intimacy. Generativity and parenting. Generativity is typically expressed not only in bringing up children and fostering growth in young people, but also in teaching, mentoring, creating, and storytelling activities that bring new knowledge into existence and pass on knowledge to the next generation. Next. Conceptually, this research does not differ A great deal from Erikson's model, stagnation and generativity are still included. It does show, however, that for the practical purposes of research and in order to understand personality in adulthood more fully, stagnation and generativity can and sometimes to operate separately and independently in adult development. So here are Erikson's key terms and concepts. And you can read it using your eyes if you want, or you can copy it in your notebook. Just pause to read if I'm too fast. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day.